But there's also societal stuff that we should be doing. And so, for example, we're not going to get required watermarking on synthetic media without regulation. And we're not going to get a better privacy regime where we have an understanding of data as belonging to the people who produced it without regulation. And we're not going to get transparency about the energy and carbon footprint of doing these things without regulation. So there's definitely things to push for. Unfortunately, the people who are making lots of money off of this have great incentive to push back against those kinds of regulations while looking like they are being upstanding citizens and advising the government on how to make this, in quotes, safe.
Hello and welcome back to Tomato. I am your host, Talia Sherman, and today's episode is a very special one for two reasons. Number one, this is the 20th episode of Tomato. And number two, this episode features the incredible Emily Bender, a computational linguist and professor of linguistics at the University of Washington. Over the past few years, Emily Bender has been a voice of reason and wisdom in this continued public endeavor to understand what the hell is going on with AI. What is going on with large language models like ChatGPT? What's up with image generation? Why are deepfakes so convincing? If you're anything like me, you have been very confused, surprised, perplexed, but altogether probably very impressed with the advancements in artificial intelligence technology. We've had convincing text done by large language models like ChatGPT, we've had image generation courtesy of DALL-E, and now we have deepfakes. And while that's exciting to a degree that you can make a deepfake of Miley Cyrus singing a Beyonce song that sounds pretty convincing, as you'll hear in this episode, there's also a lot of danger in the reality that pretty soon, if not already, we won't be able to tell the difference between real and fake, between something that someone actually said and something that someone told ChatGPT to write. And so today's episode is incredibly important if you're interested in understanding the difference between the language that an LLM uses versus the language that humans use, and why that difference matters. And of course, as well, this episode will answer all your questions about why this technology poses a problem for our society, our legal system, and our information ecosystem if synthetic media continues to be unmarked and unregulated. And I know that over the past few years, Emily Bender has absolutely spellbound audiences all over the world. Yes, she has done academic research and published articles of that nature, but she's also been engaging with the public and with general audiences. You might have read her work in The Scientific American, The Guardian, Business Insider, New York Magazine. You might have heard her on podcasts like Factually or Tech Won't Save Us. But for me, the moment that I absolutely fell in love with Emily Bender's message was when I heard her say, clearly and unequivocally, that all scholarship is an explicitly political activity. I will let that sink in. All scholarship is an explicitly political activity. To me, that was a very powerful assertion to make. But my question is, what do we do with that? Well, for Emily Bender, it's that she's been publicizing the political nature of her expertise and research as a computational linguist. But for all of us, perhaps it's interesting to broaden our definition of scholarship or expand our definition of what's political. How are all our actions political? When we go to ChatGPT and ask it to generate synthetic text, how is the creation and dissemination of that information inherently political? And what's explicitly political about who owns data or about the fact that synthetic media isn't watermarked? If nothing else, I hope this episode will keep those questions reverberating around in your mind. But for now, please enjoy the insanely intelligent Emily Bender. Emily Bender, welcome to the podcast. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. I'm happy to be joining you.
Yes. So first off, just please introduce yourself. Tell everyone who you are, what you do, why you do it, and et cetera, et cetera.
Just, the meaning of life. Sure. So my name is Emily M. Bender, and I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I have been doing linguistics, I guess I discovered it the second semester of my freshman year in the early 1990s and fell in love immediately and had the great good fortune to get to continue on to graduate studies and then eventually land a faculty position. I studied in graduate school syntax and sociolinguistics, but now I do primarily computational linguistics. And I am very interested in the the boundary between linguistics and computational linguistics. So bringing linguistic knowledge into language technology and bringing computational methods into linguistic study. And that was my story of myself up until about 2019, when I started really engaging with the broader field and then with the media about ridiculous claims about so-called AI. People saying that language models were understanding language. In fact, language models were, if not directly artificial general intelligence, then a step towards that. And sitting where I do in my linguist seat, I thought, nope, that's not true. And I can see why it's not true. And so I started working on trying to make that clear to the broader public and people working in tech and computer science.
Yes. And then, so I guess the reason that you're here is because we both met at the Linguistic Society of America's annual meeting, and you gave a talk called What We Can Do with What We Know About How Language Works. And this was largely pulling from your big paper that I think earned you a lot of press and attention, called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots, Can Language Models Be Too Big? Parrot emoji. So explain a little about that. What was that? What was the impetus for that paper? And I know that paper was published a few years ago. So sort of how do you feel now, given the proliferation of all these ChatGPT models and things? Yeah.
So that paper was written in late 2020. So you got to put yourself back to, everybody's basically stay at home. My job is certainly one that was a work from home job during that phase of the pandemic. And it started as a Twitter DM conversation between me and Dr. Timnit Gebru, who at the time was a research scientist at Google, co-leading their AI ethics team with Dr. Margaret Mitchell. And Dr. Gebru noticed that there was this drive to bigger and bigger language models at Google. And as an AI ethicist, she was saying, well, it's also our job to think about what the possible problems are. So she contacted me saying, hey, do you know of any papers sort of summarizing this? Have you written something? Anybody else? And I said, no such papers that I know of, but here's 6 things off the top of my head that I think should belong in that paper. And this is in early September of 2020. And I wrote back to her and I said the next day, hey, that feels like a paper outline. You want to write this paper? And how about we submit it to this conference called FACT, which is Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. And she said, oh, I'm really busy. I don't know, but let me ask around, and brought in 4 other members of her team. I brought my PhD student on board, and a month later, we submitted this paper that, just want to say that's not how research papers usually get written. Right? Just so you know, from, hey, let's write a paper to submitting it in a month is not a reasonable expectation in general. The reason that worked was there were 7 of us, and it was largely a survey paper, and a survey paper for which we had already done most of the reading. So we were writing about what we had already read, and gets submitted. And at the time, we thought that the thing about the paper was going to be that it has an emoji in the title. And later on down the line, there was this fun point where I got to tell the Association for Computing Machinery that some of their forms were not Unicode compliant, as they rejected the emoji. So that was a fun moment. Anyway, papers submitted. And, we thought we were going to ruffle some feathers, especially at OpenAI, because our main running example is GPT-3 in that paper, which was new at that point. And in fact, we ruffled some feathers at Google. And though the paper had been approved by Google to be submitted publicly through their pub approve process, later, while it was being reviewed for the conference, somebody at Google got upset and said to Dr. Gebru, take this paper out of the conference, retract it, or take all the Googler names off of it. And she said, after reflection, this is not okay. It's literally my job to write research papers about AI ethics and publish them. This was literally her job at Google. And so she pushed back and said, what happened here? I need to know for the future who made this decision and how this is going to work down the line. Otherwise, I will work with my manager to find a suitable end date. And Google comes back with, we accept your resignation. She had not offered a resignation. So she and her team say that she got resignated. Basically, they fired her. And it became a big deal in the media. So all of a sudden, there's enormous interest in this paper, which is part of why you said, it's famous and influential. I think it's a solid paper. And boy, did we put polish on it between then and when it actually got published, because we knew there was going to be even more attention on it. But have you heard of the Streisand effect?
The Barbra Streisand effect? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's an example of that, right? If Google's goal was to either have this paper not be widely read or have it not be associated with Google, they failed miserably on both counts. So, we were writing in 2020, looking at this trend where everybody was just trying to make the language models bigger and bigger and bigger. And we saw problems with energy consumption and associated environmental impacts. We saw problems with basically limited access to the research field if you have to be sitting on top of one of these enormous piles of data to even do research. We saw problems with bias in the training data, which is being collected entirely haphazardly and in an undocumented fashion. We saw problems with synthetic text that sounds very plausible, but isn't what anybody is trying to communicate. And there's about 6 kinds of problems. And they basically, one of them is the synthetic text issue, which is what we call stochastic parrots. And the idea behind the metaphor of stochastic parrots is that these things seem to be saying things that make sense, but they are only parroting back text from the training data. Stochastic means randomly according to some probability distribution. So it's not just literally picking a sentence from here and a sentence from there, but putting words together that into what might be new strings, but they are still just based on the probabilities in the training data rather than the machine having a thought that it wants to communicate. But to us people, it looks like a thought being communicated, and then lots of problems happen.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's sort of been this paper I mean, I understand that it got the most press, but like you published a lot since then. So it's interesting that that's the one that everyone keeps on coming back to because
Yeah,
back then I don't know, like when you published a paper, if I had been aware of it, I would not have known what ChatGPT was, I think like at the time.
it didn't exist yet.
It did. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and what's I think really interesting about that timing. So, we wrote that in late 2020, reacting to GPT-3 and also this push within Google and other places to make bigger and bigger ones. Like that was the trend that we saw and we're reacting to. And the issues and dangers that we identified have not been addressed.
Yeah.
And so when ChatGPT drops and all of a sudden it's not just the tech world, but the English speaking world at large and some other language communities as well who are interested in this and excited in this, our paper remained relevant and became relevant to a broader audience. So that was not necessarily the typical trajectory for a research paper.
Yeah. And how do you feel now that none of these concerns have been addressed? And yet there's not just ChatGPT, but there's the one through Notion, there's like the Bing, and there's so many.
Yeah, yeah. It feels bad. And it's not just the issues that we are identified in that paper, but I have another paper from 2022 with Shirag Shah called Situating Search, where we talk about how large language models are a terrible replacement for information access systems for web search. And that paper was reacting to a paper that came out of Google, basically saying, here's a research program about how to use large language models in search. And we looked at that and said, what a terrible idea. Here's a paper describing why it's a terrible idea. That paper got far less attention. I mean, we have a couple of op-eds and there's a couple of news articles about it, but not a huge amount. And then everyone dives in with both feet, right? Meta produces Galactica and says that it's a scientific information access system, which it absolutely wasn't. This was the language model trained on scientific text that lasted 3 days before it got laughed off the internet, because
Wow.
that's not science. And then ChatGPT comes immediately after that and is presented as an information access system, and then it's integrated into Bing, and then Google does Bard. And I'm sitting there going, this is still a terrible idea, right? But without anybody, the situating search paper was written by just 2 people at the University of Washington, so we didn't get fired over it. So there's not a lot of attention on it.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
depressing if that's what it
Mhm.
takes to get attention on a paper. You have to be fired for it. But
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, there's other ways too. And yeah, it was a bad scene. But I really think that Dr. Gabru and Dr. Mitchell did an excellent job sort of weathering that storm and holding true to their own goals in their research and in their career trajectories, and figuring out how to chart that path, which is really impressive, and how to talk about it in the media while they're going through. Like, could you imagine being fired and then having to deal with the media?
Yeah. I mean, that's telling, right? That a company as large as Google would fire someone on their ethics team,
Right.
right? It's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it says that there's a lot at stake for Google. And I don't know if that's financially or their publicity or I don't even know, but why would you do that?
Yeah.
Right. So let's jump into the dangers of all of this. There's this issue first of how an LLM learns and uses language quite differently from a human. And like, why is that a problem? But really, what makes these things so potentially powerful, dangerous, have the ability to take over a lot of things in our world, including maybe threaten our democracy, harm our planet, et cetera, et cetera. What is at stake here?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that the things themselves aren't taking over anything or harming democracy. It's people and companies using them to do that. And it's really important to always keep the people in the frame. And one of the sources of danger is that this is the first time that a very large population of speakers can routinely encounter text that seems completely plausible, but didn't actually come from a person. And the reason I say a very large population of speakers is that we don't have this technology for all 7,000 of the world's languages,
Right.
right? It absolutely does not exist for Sinhala. It does not exist for American Sign Language, right? This is English and a few other widely spoken, widely represented on the internet languages have this. So it's not the whole world, but it's a big part of the world that is now faced with synthetic text that looks plausible. And we have to figure out how to live with that. And some of it is information literacy on the part of the public, but some of it should also be regulation, right? I think that it should always be clear when you're encountering synthetic media. So that's one set of dangers. Another set of dangers is the way this represents a centralization of power, that we are living in a moment where the tech companies have just asserted that it is natural and fine to amass as much data as they can get their hands on, as opposed to an alternate view, which is the natural state of affairs is that we own our data and we choose what it gets used for. And, there's this idea that, well, you posted it publicly, so anybody can see it. Well, yeah, there's a big difference between somebody walking up or loading up that page and looking at it versus someone lumping it into a data set where it can get used in various other ways. In terms of threats to democracy, I think that follows from the threat to what I call the information ecosystem. Information ecosystem is all of the ways that we access information. It's the relationships of trust between information providers and information consumers. And it's the way information sites are sort of connected together. So for example, if you post a book on Amazon as a self-published author or otherwise, there's another site called Goodreads that reads from Amazon and connects things. There's an author named Jane Friedman who was being spoofed. So somebody was posting books on Amazon under her name that were not her books. And they ended up not only in her Amazon listings, but also in her Goodreads profile. So this is an example of basically synthetic information spilling over from one part of the information ecosystem to another. The reason this is a problem for democracy is that if we want to have an informed voting public, then we need people to be able to find trustworthy information and trust it when they've found it. And the more we're faced with synthetic media, the harder both of those things become.
So it's a problem of the size, and it's not as if it is itself powerful, and as you said, it is not autonomous. This AI is not autonomous, but it is a matter of just how much stuff it produces, and do we have the human power to mitigate that and to
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we do have power to mitigate it. And in some cases, it's individual choices we can make. So I think as individuals, we can be sticklers for authenticity. So don't post synthetic media, don't reshare it if somebody's posted it, because it's not just text, right? These systems can be used to generate really real looking images at this point.
Yeah.
And that's not computational linguistics, but some of the underlying algorithms are very similar. So you have synthetic images and synthetic text and synthetic audio and synthetic video. And there was one point where I was scrolling Facebook on my phone and I saw this really cute baby peacock. And I thought, "Aw," and I hit share. And two of my friends wrote back immediately saying that's fake. And I thought, oh, yeah, okay. So I undid the share, and this was late at night. So the next morning I thought, okay, I should look into this. What does a baby peacock really look like? And then I went searching on like Google Images, and what came back was a mixture of that fake image, other ones like it, and images that looked very different and were probably real. And then I started clicking through and trying to figure out, okay, so how do I know which of these is coming from a reliable source? And like, okay, finally I found one that it was a source that I wasn't familiar with. I wanted to find something like Audubon or somebody like that, who I knew was like existing organization that knows something about birds. And eventually I found a site that was unfamiliar to me, but I sort of clicking through and reading it and looking at its context, it looks like it was a serious site. And so I wrote up a blog post basically talking about what it took to effectively clean up this baby peacock that had been sullied by this synthetic information slick that had been spilled, right? So backing up all the way out of that, there's these individual choices we make about what do we share, right? If we see something that seems compelling, there's a reflex really, like, oh, that's fun, click, right? Um, and to sort of stop and think and say, okay, what am I sharing here? Is this legitimate? Am I working to remain a source of authentic information? But there's also societal stuff that we should be doing. And so, for example, we're not going to get required watermarking on synthetic media without regulation. And we're not going to get a better privacy regime where we have an understanding of data as belonging to the people who produced it without regulation. And we're not going to get transparency about the energy and carbon footprint of doing these things without regulation. So there's definitely things to push for. Unfortunately, the people who are making lots of money off of this have great incentive to push back against those kinds of regulations while looking like they are being upstanding citizens and advising the government on how to make this, in quotes, safe.
Right. I think there's this idea that they can kind of put out there that this is sort of this tool that will equalize, because like everyone can use, well, ChatGPT, it's currently free and you can use it to do all kinds of things, create images, what have you, create synthetic text, but at what cost? And are you creating fake New York Times articles, and are you creating fake legal cases and things of that nature? I like that you're saying that it starts with governance, because it does, because there's a lot of angles we can take to say that AI, it just needs to be curbed, right? That it's important that we start with governance. I also want to say that when we were at the LSA and they were kind of playing around, I think, with DALL-E, and they were a picture of a linguist, and up comes a nice white guy in a room with a book and a globe, and everyone's sort of like, and they go, picture of a female linguist, right? And then that generates, and it's a white woman in a room.
Still,
right.
Yeah, white woman. Yeah.
And so that is something that we see in images, but we also see that in language, right? Like synthetic text using masculine pronouns for positions that we would stereotypically associate with men, and et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I actually do kind of want to go there. How does bias come through AI? How does AI specifically amplify bias? You talked about this a lot in your speech, but I think it's interesting because in some ways you can say that we can use AI to kind of figure out or further investigate the ways that bias still lives in our world, and sort of, this AI is being trained off data that exists. So therefore you could say that this is real, but really it is a problem if it continues to be underscored and amplified in synthetic text.
Yeah. So first of all, I try really hard to avoid using the phrase AI, especially without putting scare quotes around it, because I think that it actually makes it harder to understand what it is that we're talking about. So it's useful to talk about automation. It's useful to talk about pattern recognition. It's useful to talk about synthetic media. Sometimes I say synthetic media extruding machines to give you a sense of how I feel about that synthetic media. So when you said that, everybody can use ChatGPT and for now it's free and you can use it to write fake legal cases and write fake New York Times articles. And I'm thinking, what are those for? Like, why would you want that, right? So it's worthwhile, I think, to talk about not AI, but specific automation. And one of the things that gets called AI is a bunch of techniques from a subfield of computer science called machine learning. And that's already kind of a problematic term because learning usually denotes a human activity. Machine learning is basically statistical methods for finding regularities in some training data. And then you can do a bunch of different things with those regularities. So you can just study what they are. And that's when you're talking about, like, it's great to use this to figure out where the biases are. You're just using statistical analysis to find correlations. And, we would like to live in a world where if we had dismantled the various systems of oppression, then you wouldn't find correlations between specific genders and specific jobs, and you wouldn't find correlations between specific racialized identities and specific jobs or life experiences. And we can look through our text to see what correlations there are, keeping in mind that the texts aren't the world, right? The texts are what people have chosen to say about the world. And depending on the corpus we've collected, we might be coming up with a description that was intended to be a description of the actual world, or we might be also including fictional worlds. And so this comes back to the point about you really want to collect your corpora intentionally and curate them rather than just grab stuff willy-nilly. So you can certainly study bias in the way we talk about the world. And if you've collected a corpus that is intended to be nonfiction, then with some degree of uncertainty, bias in the actual world. You can also use these machine learning systems to do classification. So given a whole bunch of training data with inputs and associated labels, here's some new data with no label. Given the patterns in the past, what should this label be? And that can be useful, although you really want to test it in your intended use case and think about what happens when it's wrong. What are the failure modes? And then another thing you can do, although again, I always want to think about like, well, what's this for, is the synthetic media thing, where you can take those patterns and say, okay, what if we just let the system run and see what comes out? And now we have made up a silly recipe, or we have made up, the famous example was instructions for extracting a peanut butter sandwich out of a VCR in the style of Shakespeare. Like that was something that people were really excited about in the early days of ChatGPT. So in those cases, if you are using it to classify, then the biases from the training data are going to come into play. And if you're using it to just output synthetic media, they are absolutely going to come into play. And a lot of what went into building ChatGPT was trying to combat those biases. And they did that by doing lots more data labeling, where it was basically producing a whole bunch of training data to try to push back against the biases that were going to come out naturally from the first layer of training data. And of course, you can't do that perfectly. And then on top of that, they put some additional things that might just be like, if it detects a keyword, it triggers this patch where it'll say something like, I'm afraid I can't do that. And I forget the exact language, but people are now finding that language in Amazon product descriptions, which is showing that people are using the synthetic text extruding machine that they have access to for free to create fake descriptions of presumably fake and fraudulent products on Amazon, and then not even checking the output to make sure that it says something halfway reasonable. So again, speaking about the information ecosystem, that shows us that a bunch of those descriptions are fake. Okay, but what about the ones that are not obviously fake, and so on?
Yeah. So a couple things: over reliance, right,
Mhm.
on large language models, over reliance on these things, but also to go back to earlier what you said, there's the issue of always personifying or using personifying language when we're talking about large language models or things of that sort, right?
Yeah.
To call it artificial intelligence
Mhm.
is, well, artificial intelligence is an oxymoron, but we've sort of gotten so used to seeing that phrase. I think that it's good that you're pointing out that it is a stochastic parrot, and that's not human. So I was on a plane quite recently. I was flying back from the LSA conference, and I started talking to the guy next to me, and I said, oh, I was at a linguistics conference, and there was a talk on large language models and things like that. And he said, okay, what is the linguist's perspective on why the language that an LLM spits out is intrinsically different from human speech? And I said, well, there's like this whole threat to democracy, and it can create fake news articles, and it can. And he's like, no, I get all that. I get that it can be used by humans to do harm, right? To put out fake synthetic text, fake images, fake news articles. What is the actual argument from a linguist perspective of why this language is so radically different? And I was wondering if maybe you could shed any light, because I think that some people are like, well, I get that it can be used for harm, but what if we can't even tell the difference? Then what am I really doing? Am I, if I'm writing an essay
Yeah.
or using it to write an Amazon product review, like, saying it's on a real product, what's the actual difference between these languages?
Yeah. So if you're just looking at language as form, as there's a string of words that exists, then yeah, it's going to be indistinguishable because it's designed that way, right? The whole purpose of a synthetic text extruding machine is to produce synthetic text that's a really good approximation of non-synthetic text. So what's the opposite of synthetic text? The opposite of synthetic text is authentic language use. And authentic language use is language that was used by some person or sometimes a committee for some communicative purpose. Somebody had something that they wanted to say. They chose some words to say it, and they put those words out in the world in some form. That's missing in ChatGPT. Nobody meant it, right? There's no person there or mind or entity there that can have a communicative intent behind the words. And what's really weird is that this is the first time that those of us who speak these languages that have large language models can possibly encounter so much text that nobody meant. One of my favorite responses to ChatGPT, and I wish I knew who this came from. It's not me, it's not original to me, but it's great, is if nobody could be bothered to write that, why should I bother to read it? Right. So if somebody is using ChatGPT to create some boilerplate text because there's some nuisance writing they have to do, there's absolutely no reason to read it. It's not anybody's thoughts. So it's another way of saying that what's missing there is the relationality. And here there's some wonderful work by Dr. Abeba Birhane, who's a cognitive scientist who also works in the AI ethics space. And she basically points out that Western philosophy is really grounded in rationalism, which sort of prioritizes the individual, and the idea is that, the best stuff happens sort of in your own head and just like being super rational and learning how to do logic and then applying it. Where there's other ways of thinking about these things that are grounded in relationships between people and our responsibilities to each other, but also just the way that we sort of become and are fully ourselves by being in relationship with other people. And I think that this conversation about what's the difference between synthetic text extruded from ChatGPT and very similar looking words that a person said is that when people speak, it's relational. It's about the speaker and the hearer, or the speaker and the audience, even if they're not in the same room, right? Thinking about your audience in this podcast, we're talking to each other, but we're also talking for them, right? So you and I have them in mind, and they have us in mind as they're listening. And so even though we don't know these people, there's still a relationship here, and we are still understanding each other based on, in part, that relationship.
Yeah. And as you said in your talk a little bit, that, this is a key part of language acquisition. How we as babies and toddlers learn language is through relation, right? Is through feedback,
Yeah.
Interaction. And there's no interaction and relationality, as you're saying, present in how ChatGPT quote unquote learns or is trained, right? It's just being given data and, again, form and meaning, the distinction, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's being shown lots and lots of linguistic form, and the algorithms there are designed to pick up the patterns in that linguistic form so that they can reproduce them.
Yeah.
Period. And what babies do is, yes, they are exposed to linguistic form, but that alone is not enough. And there's really interesting experiments. So Patricia Kuhl at UW has a paper from 2007 showing that babies learning English exposed in an experimental setting to Mandarin won't pick up the Mandarin phonological distinctions without a chance to interact with the Mandarin speaker. So this isn't even getting to the meaning part of it. To actually get the form part of it, babies are relying on interaction, which was a surprise to me, that even at that level, interaction is key. So that was really, really cool experiments, really cool paper, and also really fun to think about. So there's this wonderful paper by, forget his first name, Baldwin, 1995, pretty sure he, him pronouns though, talking about intersubjectivity as the key thing in that interactive experience, that sense of not just paying attention to the same thing as someone else, but mutually knowing that you're both paying attention to the same thing is what allows us to communicate, and especially as babies to bootstrap the communication and understand, get all the external cues so that you can map these word forms that are coming through to what they might refer to.
I think I want to talk about sort of what your talk brought to the world of linguistics, because I felt like there was this sense of imperative and the sense of duty that you were speaking towards, is that we as linguists, as people who have knowledge of language, have the power to really affect change and to speak to the posed risks of LLMs. So you have spoken about how we need watermarking and we need good governance. But beyond that, what can we as linguists do? And how can linguists and lawmakers perhaps come together? I know that that's maybe wishful thinking, but I think that there's something to be said for the fact that your talk was titled "What We Can Do with What We Know About How Language Works," because clearly there's something to be done with that knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the first thing I want to say is that it's not only in this space of so-called artificial intelligence,
Right.
that there's a lot of things that linguists can do with what we know about how language works. And that was the focus of my talk because that's what I've been doing. But I sort of late in the talk said, actually, there's a long tradition of this, and I'm far from the only one. And there's really super work going on. So, for example, Dr. John Rickford and Dr. Cherise King are looking at how speakers of stigmatized dialects sometimes can't even be heard in legal proceedings. And so they've done careful analysis of Jontel Williams' testimony and, looked at the impact of her language variety on how she was perceived.
Yeah, I just want to add that the paper's called Hearing Rachel Jean Tell, and that's one of my favorite linguistics papers of all time, and it's vitally important, and I will link it in the episode description. I think that's like the most important linguistics paper that anyone could ever read, ever, because it really shows that if you don't speak a standard variety in a courtroom, good luck being a credible witness. And that is a problem, especially when we're dealing with a trial of George Zimmerman at the time, police officer who murdered Trayvon Martin. So that is something to think about. But yes, please continue. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And then just briefly, I also want to put in a shout out to Dr. Wesley Leonard, who was the other invited keynote plenary speaker at LSA this year, who does really amazing work bringing Indigenous perspectives to language reclamation. And basically, on the one hand, doing, work with communities, but also helping the field of linguistics become better by understanding and learning from Indigenous perspectives, where we claim often to be serving communities whose languages have been effectively stolen from them. In the words that non-Indigenous linguists tend to use are things like revitalized languages and saving languages. And Dr. Leonard talks about reclaiming languages. So that's also, him using his linguistic expertise and his ways of knowing, of being an Indigenous person himself, that contrast with what he learned in academic linguistics together to do really important work. So all that to say, there's a lot that can be done with what we know about how language works.
Yes.
And the part of it that I'm doing is in this space of combating AI hype. So one part of it for me comes from what I know from syntax. So I come from a tradition in syntax that focuses on signs. So understanding morphology, syntax, and so on as pairings of form and meaning, which means that form and meaning are different. And what I learned in talking to computer scientists who are interested in processing language was that they didn't see that. And I used to have these really confusing conversations with CS faculty at my university until I realized that language is like a rain-spattered window, where if you are peering through the window, the shapes of the raindrops sort of affect what you can see, but you can focus on the stuff through. And that was my computer science colleagues who were interested in the information about the world that was encoded in language. So they were peering through the window. But me as a linguist, I was focusing on the shape of the raindrops and what they do to the light coming through. And when I realized that we basically had our focal lengths adjusted differently, the conversation started making more sense. And at that point, it was just like, okay, here's how do I operate in this space? But then I started realizing, actually, no, there's something we know in linguistics that computer science really needs to know, because they think they're looking through something entirely transparent, but there's raindrops on that window. And those raindrops are, syntax and semantics, but also sociolinguistic variation and all kinds of things where what they're getting in the text is not meaning, it's form. And if you want to get to the meaning, you've got to do some processing that we can't fully do computationally. We can only approximate. And then beyond that, even the meaning isn't the world, right? It's what people said about the world. So from syntax, semantics, and also a bit sociolinguistics there was that lesson. And then from sociolinguistics, there's everything I've learned from people who do far more sociolinguistics than me about how languages always vary, how we use that to produce and project our personae into the world, how different varieties can be stigmatized. And so that leads me to things like, you can't just build technology for the standardized variety of a language and then put it out in the world in any way that you would expect it to be fair and equitable. But this is not obvious if you haven't studied sociolinguistics.
Yeah. And you also, I want to point out that you have this thing called the Bender rule that you sort of coined, which is to say that if you are creating a large language model and it is using English, don't just call it natural language. You have to say what language this is in, even if it's English, right? This is not presumed English. Because I think that there is sort of this theme in everything you're saying of like imperialism and just sort of like English white supremacy kind of like infiltrating all of this, right? Because if the US or US based companies, right, are having all these LLMs and then that's all in English, right? As you said earlier in the conversation, nowhere near 7,000 languages have some sort of LLM, right? So So that is something to be aware of, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Bender rule isn't just for LLMs. It's
Yeah,
any
yeah.
research. I mean, I was talking to computational linguists where they'll say, we're doing natural language processing and they're only doing English, or we're doing machine reading. Well, it was English text. And so it was like, name the language that you're working on. I didn't call it the Bender rule, but I was going around asking people to name the language, and then other people called it the Bender rule. So I picked it up and ran with it, partially because I was amused, but also it turns out that it's actually awkward to walk up to somebody's poster at a conference or ask a question at the end of the presentation and say, excuse me, what language was this on? When it was obviously English, right? It's a awkward sort of face threatening thing to do, based it being this politeness concept, right? And I found that if people could basically blame it on me, then they had an easier time doing it. I'm like, I'm happy to lend my name to that activity if it makes it easier for someone to like sort of break through this somewhat bad social norm and, ask the question. There was something else that you said in there that I wanted to pick up on though, about
Imperialism or
yes, thank you, imperialism. I had a really interesting conversation with some researchers in the UK a couple years ago, online, pandemic, you know how this goes. And they were working on some sort of automatic speech to text system for English and trying to figure out like what to put in their ethical consideration sections of their papers and like how to deal with just the ethics of doing it. And we got into talking about how it's really, I forget what their use case was, but it was something where it was really going to matter that their system only worked for some varieties of English and not others. And they were seeming to feel a little bit put upon that they had to worry about all these other things. Like, I just want to work on my own language. And I'm like, well, yeah, well, that's the cost of being speakers of a colonialist language, is that, even though maybe we personally didn't engage in the initial phases of colonization. I mean, as a white person living in the US, I am definitely a settler benefiting from settler colonialism. Like, that's still true. Even though that's not a choice that I made, my first language is this language that has all of the different varieties all around the world because of the history of colonialism and colonization. So that's my responsibility in a way that somebody working on a language spoken much more locally wouldn't have to do. There's other things for them to work on, and you still need to be sensitive to sociolinguistic variation, but it's massive in English specifically because of imperialism and colonization. I guess sort of under the rubric of like what linguists can do, I have been spending a lot of time on public scholarship, and the first phase of that was social media. So just me being on there, having conversations with people, and then that turned to conversations with reporters. So engaging the media, the traditional media. And then that turned to conversations with policymakers. And just, it's been a really interesting journey to go from like trying to affect change by just trying to raise awareness to having more powerful tools to doing that, to actually getting to talk to decision makers. And I've talked to people in municipal government, various folks in the federal government in the US, so representatives and their staffers. I guess I haven't spoken directly with any senators yet, but I've spoken certainly to staffers of senators. I've spoken to various committees and things like the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, folks from the Department of Defense. And then internationally, I've had conversations with people in different offices in the UN, which is an enormous organization, and the IMF, so the International Monetary Fund. So that's been a super interesting journey. And it is, on top of my day job, there's that. But I sort of want to encourage people to embrace those opportunities when they come. And at the same time, part of my constant reminder to myself is when I'm being sought for my expertise to keep to the boundaries of that expertise. Because once you're talking to reporters and policymakers, they're not really going to know what's the difference between the question you'd ask a linguist and the question you'd ask a psychologist, for example. And so just as in teaching, in these conversations with reporters and with policymakers, I don't know are really powerful words.
yeah. Do you have any thoughts on deepfakes?
They're dangerous. Um, so there's two things that have recently dropped about deepfakes. One is that George Carlin new stand-up thing, which apparently is terrible.
Yeah.
And his daughter's really upset and like out there telling people this is awful. And he would have hated it, which seems right. And then there's a wonderful new media outlet called 404 Media. And I haven't read it yet, but they have a piece that just came out about, I want to say, high school students who were victims of deepfake porn. So there's like, it can be harmful in many directions, right? You can harm an artist's legacy. You can do deepfake porn of somebody, which is obviously humiliating and terrible.
Especially with the image generation stuff that's also happening. If you, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then there's stories of people getting scammed by someone using a deepfake audio where it sounds like it's their kid calling asking for money, and like usually a person's voice is good enough identification, and that's not true anymore. And then of course there's massive issues, well, twofold, right? So in the political sphere, you could have a deepfake of a candidate saying something that they didn't say that could be, scandalous. And then rumor always, what's the Mark Twain quote? Rumor has gone around the world before truth has gotten its shoes tied or something. Yeah, it's not quite that, but something along those lines. So it's really hard to combat in that fashion. But then also, as soon as these things exist, and they do, then anybody who's caught on tape doing something incriminating can say, oh, that's just a deep fake. And that's already happening also.
Oh, so it was the other direction. That's a really
Yeah.
important point. Yeah. Yeah. There's been a lot of conversations about sort of the implications, especially for young people if we're creating deepfake porn and they're sort of a minor. It's really interesting. I see a lot of deepfakes now that are just like strange. Like Instagram recommended for me the other day a deepfake of Trump, Obama, and Biden explaining like basic algebra, like how to take like the slope for something of like some curve. And I thought, okay,
Uh-huh.
like that's convincing. But obviously that can go in other directions that are not so benign as explaining y equals whatever. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, that Instagram post sounds like a really good bit of public education,
Yeah.
saying, hey, this exists, because nobody would mistake that for real.
Mhm.
I mean, Trump explaining algebra, it's not going to
Right.
happen.
Yeah.
The other two, maybe. Trump, definitely not. And so that helps people say, okay, this is a thing that exists now. I need to up my information literacy. But at the same time, if you go to the space of, well, then I can't believe anything I see at all, then society falls apart, basically. We just become atomized. If you can only trust the people that you know personally and you see face to face,
Yeah.
we can't function in a society as large as ours.
And that brings up again the point of watermarking. We need that, right? Because
Right.
then we can tell the difference. Because
Yeah.
currently they're saying we can't, but we need
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And one thing that we didn't get to, but is interesting, is sort of the watermarking can be watermarking synthetic media, so it can be stripped away, but you can also use watermarking to vouch for the authenticity of authentic media.
Mhm.
And that's valuable. It's an added expense, but it's something that probably will start happening for official communications, and it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, because it gives you that
Yeah.
incentive as a consumer of like, oh, I know this
Right.
is,
Right.
yeah, that's
Right.
interesting. Why linguistics? And in your case, I think it's important if we think about, why linguistics helps us in particular to better handle these complications that come up with the inventions of humans.
Yeah.
Because it's more than like LLMs. There's a lot of things, roboted, automated things that do lots of things. And you've talked before about the dangers of, right, robo everything. Can we just have robo lawyers, robo therapists, right? No.
Right.
So yeah.
Why linguistics? Yeah. Well, first of all, why linguistics? Because it's fun, right? It is really cool to get to spend time studying language. So if you have the good fortune to, even if you're studying something else, but there's a linguistics class you can take as an elective and it's intriguing to you, go for it, right? Like it's especially like imagining that a large part of your audience is currently at university. And there's a lot of pressure these days to like major in something that's going to become a job, and seeing the university as job training. And I want to just sort of push back on that a little bit. Like, yes, get skills. Yes, the job at the other end is really important, but also your time at university is really time to sort of explore and learn about the world and learn about different ways of thinking about the world. And so if linguistics sounds like fun and you've got an elective, go for it. Like, go take a linguistics class. So yeah, first of all, just because it's fun, but also we use language in so many facets of our lives, in so many different ways. We use language in education. We use language. I mean, the law is constructed in language, and there's a lot of legal work is on the one hand trying to draft the language that will durably have the effect that it's intended to have. And on the other hand, trying to use that drafted language to whatever purpose. And so if you have a really good idea about how language works, then that's really helpful there. If you are, a lawyer, if you are a policymaker, if you are trying to talk to lawyers and policymakers, we also use language to construct our identities, as sociolinguists tell us. And understanding how that works can be really helpful in any case where identities and welcoming and accepting people as they really are and as their full selves is valuable. I mean, that's valuable everywhere, right? So an understanding of how people use linguistic variation to do that can be empowering in those moments. And as we understand more about how people use language to reflect and construct our social world, you are empowered to really get in there and do interesting things with it in all of those domains or in your appreciation of those domains. So I'm sort of saying everything but the AI question here in this answer. But I also think that because language is used in all of these domains, when we have synthetic text, it can look like, oh, well, we can have a robo-lawyer then because it can give us legal documents, and we can have a robo-doctor then because it can give us medical advice. And a linguist can tell you the form of a legal document is not a legal document. And something that just has the form of medical advice is not actually medical advice. The content matters. And it was surprising to me to realize a couple years ago that that form meaning distinction is really non-obvious to people just going about their lives. And so it's an important message that linguists can bring, I think, to the world to say, hey, let's focus on this thing and keep it in mind as we're making decisions about this technology.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with the legendary and inspiring Emily Bender from the University of Washington. Thank you so much to her for coming on the podcast. She's doing incredible work right now. I'm sure that was clear in the interview, so I encourage everyone to read her articles and listen to her on another podcast, or even just familiarize yourself with the ongoing scholarship regarding machine learning and LLMs, the work that she's participating in alongside many other brilliant scientists around the world. All that's linked in the episode description if you're interested. As a reminder, as always, please rate, review, subscribe, and pass along the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I will speak to you next time. Bye.